In the name of Cain! In the name of Cain! In the name of Cain! Cain lives!
Baby, don't you know it? I'm hardly heroic. Baby, let's roll it, 'cause I'm hardly heroic.
Hello everyone, welcome to a bit of a stranger video for this channel, at least. As you all know, I'm really into tabletop wargames, and I have made several videos on this channel talking about wargames that I'm very familiar with, such as Warhammer Fantasy. I do plan on expanding my coverage of other games into things such as War Machine and maybe even Kings of War, but I also take a great interest in trying to make tabletop games of my own. I think that any person who plays video games is going to want to eventually think about making games of their own. So as somebody who plays a lot of tabletop games, I think trying to make your own tabletop games are definitely a part of that process. So I've been a longtime fan of the Command & Conquer franchise, and I've really enjoyed the type of setting that they've managed to create over 3 very different games. I think that we've never really had an attempt to make a Command & Conquer tabletop game. In part, I think because the type of gameplay that you've got in Command & Conquer is very different to other types of RTS games, with the specific kinds of base building and so on and so forth. Base building as a concept doesn't necessarily translate well to tabletop games, which are turn-based and relatively static, at least by comparison. That being said, I did want to try and create a Command & Conquer inspired tabletop game, and I'm creating this video to introduce to you a project that I'm very, very proud of called Tiberium Exodus. So what is Tiberium Exodus? Well, Tiberium Exodus, or TE as I'll call it, is an attempt to create a Command & Conquer inspired tabletop game set in an alternative timeline to the main Command & Conquer Tiberium games. A lot of people have, I think, very strong memories of these Command & Conquer games. Unfortunately, the series did not end very well, thanks to the executive meddling of EA. But I think we've had a very interesting setting in that Tiberium world. And as time went on, I think some people might have disagreed or agreed with where the games were going. I personally have always found, at least up until Command & Conquer 3, Kane's Wrath, the world to be quite interesting. So I wanted to try and create an alternative setting for this game, and I wanted to also borrow from some of my other favorite strategy games at the time. You'll see as we go along that I borrowed very heavily from aspects of the Homeworld series, specifically Deserts of Karak. Mechanically, I think that this game is a very different one to the types of games that you might be more familiar with playing, and I hope that it makes it interesting. So right now, you can download the rules completely free of charge. I think there'll be a link in the description where you can get them. I've got basically a rulebook put together. It's even got some art, which I think definitely adds to everything. I've created a bunch of lore that explains the deviation of the world, and I'll get into that later in the video. And I also want to talk a little bit about the way that mechanics work in this game. If you want me to make a full video describing how to play the game, I can do that as well. Definitely I can do that. One thing that I want to emphasize with this game, in particular if you want to look at the models, is that I originally designed this game to operate at a smaller scale than maybe some of the strategy games, tabletop games that you might be used to. It's much smaller than 28mm scale. It's closer to, I guess, something like a 10mm or maybe even 6mm. The gameplay itself will revolve around mostly using vehicles. There are some infantry units, but it's mostly about vehicle-based warfare, as you'll see in the lore explanations. The other interesting thing, depending on your perspective, is that the models that I've originally designed for this game are made out of Lego. I do have some plans to make a video series in the future talking about the potential for Lego as a wargaming tool. as something that people can use in their war games, or even as a replacement for certain aspects of their war games. But I originally planned on designing a set of Lego features and units, and then I just turned that into the basis for this game. So you can see, you'll see later on, the artwork for the units is Lego. I basically built models, and each unit in the game has a Lego model, but that doesn't mean that you should be constrained by that. If you want to use your own miniatures, if you want to maybe 3D print something, or if you want to go with your own designs, you're more than welcome to. I want this project is obviously not meant for commercial properties, so I'm not using a license that I own. This is just a fan project, nothing more than that. I want to encourage people to simply think about the potential for Command & Conquer as a tabletop setting, and I also just wanted to share this project with people that might actually be interested in it. Let me say that. If you have ideas, or if you'd like to help contribute to the project, then by all means, you're more than welcome to send me a message. The channel has an email address, and if you have any queries about the game itself, feel free to leave them in the comments. I will be more than happy to answer them as and when they show up. Okay, so Tiberium Exodus, or TE, takes place in an alternative timeline to the mainline Tiberium series of games. The basic idea is that the game series takes place in this timeline, which diverges at the final hours of the Second Tiberium War. If you remember, Command & Conquer the Tiberium series primarily started with Tiberium Dawn, and the second game, Tiberium Sun, was one of my favorite games. And at the end of that game, we have the conclusion of the Second Tiberium War. There is, so in terms of the deviation, I want to spell out exactly what happens, and then I can show you where timelines will diverge. So in that game, the GDI assault on Cairo Pyramid will continue, but they will suffer heavy casualties. Something that I've always found kind of unusual, and again, this is because of a separation between gameplay and story, is that Commander MacNeil assaults that temple, even though he knows, and he's told by General Solomon, that he doesn't have the sufficient amount of forces to do it. So in theory, he shouldn't have been able to succeed as he did. Maybe, of course, you can always point to the superior gameplay abilities of the player, but in theory, I think he should suffer very heavy casualties as a result of this assault. The GDI forces that get deployed must be deployed very hastily without the kinds of requisite planning or strategy that you might need for a campaign of this scale to be effective. Because of these issues, MacNeil is unable to stop the launch of Kane's world-altering missile, or WAM. Now, if you remember, the world-altering missile is basically Kane's plot. He wants to gather a whole bunch of Tiberium into a missile that he's going to launch into the atmosphere, and this is going to alter all life on the planet, essentially turning the entire planet and all life on it into Tiberium-based life. So MacNeil is unable to stop the launch of the missile because he's too late. His forces have taken too many casualties, and unfortunately Umagon has to sacrifice herself so that the missile can be damaged, but that it is still effectively launched. This Cairo facility subsequently will be destroyed, but MacNeil will be unable to retrieve the Tacitus or confirm Kane's death, and this puts GDI in a perilous position after the war. If you remember, the GDI forces are basically triumphant at the end of the Second Tiberium War. Kane is killed by MacNeil, or at least it appears that he's killed by MacNeil, and they are able to retrieve the Tacitus, and that puts them in a much better position. So we have the world-altering missile that gets launched, but it's in a damaged state, and it doesn't immediately transform all life on the planet into Tiberium-based life. Instead, what it does is create a massive cloud of Tiberium ash that is present in the atmosphere, and that this will come to blanket the planet, but not for at least a few years. Because GDI is unable to confirm that Kane is dead, the Brotherhood will be able to survive because Kane will disappear but not be wounded as he originally was in the end of the story. So he will be able to successfully help the Brotherhood escape from total GDI destruction, but Kane is not necessarily a focal point of our story. And of course, because Kane takes Cabal with him when he disappears, it doesn't end up precipitating the Firestorm crisis. And because GDI don't have the Tacitus, because again, Kane was able to escape, their attempts to combat the Tiberium infestation are essentially doomed. Remember that in the lore, in order for GDI to start affecting some kind of environmental restoration, they needed to have the Tacitus to unlock the resonant frequency of Tiberium, so that they could develop sonic technology that could effectively deal with Tiberium crystals, at least in the beginning. Because they don't have the Tacitus, they don't have this technology, their attempts to develop anti-Tiberium technology are essentially curtailed. So, we end up here with something which I call the Tiberium Winter. The world looks to the skies in horror. Kane's plan to transform the planet into Tiberium-based life has failed, but not entirely. GDI scientists indicate that the Tiberium ash cloud is slowly growing over the atmosphere, and it's mixing with the baseline atmosphere, transforming it. Not immediately, but eventually this will come to encompass the entire planet, and eventually all life on the planet will end. Life as we know it will end, because the atmosphere itself will be toxic to life. This planet has years, maybe decades at most, maybe a decade at most, before the entire planet is deemed too hostile to support human life, at least on the surface. So without the Tacitus, our GDI scientists are kind of stuck. They have no idea if they could even reverse this, and they don't know if they can actually do anything about it. They dub this coming apocalypse the Tiberium Winter, and it's a reference to a similar outcome of a nuclear war, where at the end of a nuclear war, the entire planet is blanketed in ash, which has the effect of cooling everything down, because literally the skies are choked with ash. But instead of radiation, we have toxic Tiberium that will eventually overtake the atmosphere and choke all carbon-based life from the Earth. GDI is unwilling to surrender to total extinction. They know they don't have the most amount of time. They have maybe a few decades at most. But they're unable to stop the Tiberium Winter from overtaking the planet. So they speculate that if they can wait, what the GDI scientists say is that if they can somehow wait for the winter to abate, if they can wait for the ash cloud to dissipate, it might be at least, the Earth might be at least partially habitable again, or so they hope. And so immediately the GDI planning structures, the higher echelons, execute an emergency survival plan. They don't have the time to transfer all the people in the world, so they start to use what remains of their considerable resources to build survival shelters for mankind to go deep into the Earth. The idea is just like a bunker might be deep enough to survive a nuclear blast, we are going to build these shelters deep into the Earth where humanity can continue to survive and weather out the Tiberium Winter in relative safety. These bunkers are going to be deep enough and essentially self-sufficient so that they can sustain populations. However, this is not a plan for the majority of humanity. This is something that can preserve a lot of people, definitely more people than if the plan wasn't executed, but definitely not the vast majority of the people who are still left on the planet. And so this emphasizes, I think, the core fundamental contradiction in GDI ideology. They are better than the Brotherhood in a lot of ways, right? The Brotherhood will just openly kill people that are even ostensibly loyal to it. But GDI's inability to cover everybody is a failing of their sort of like system. They have a lot of resources, sure, but they tend to concentrate those resources amongst their own member nations, the G7, rather than trying to distribute them very widely. So the majority of the people of the Earth are going to have an issue. What do they do? So the Brotherhood is in disarray after the Second Tiberium War. GDI is in theory victorious, but not as totally as they were in the other timeline. And so they're able to devote their collective might for the survival plan, right? The building of the Tiberium shelters. Because Kane disappears with Cabal, the Brotherhood is kind of left in the lurch. They were able to successfully escape from Cairo, but after that Kane disappears for some reason. And nobody knows where he goes. And they don't understand why GDI haven't followed up necessarily. They're not quite sure about the implications of the Tiberium Winter. Instead, what happens is a Brotherhood civil war, right? Various factions will fight for control of the Brotherhood, and various factions will also try to figure out what they want to do in response to the Tiberium Winter. There are lots of speculations in the lore about what actually happens here. Some people will indicate that the Brotherhood just tried to build their own subterranean shelters, or they attacked or took over GDI ones. That's one idea. Certainly, we know that the Brotherhood have sufficient technology in tunneling, with things like the Montauk and the tunnel network. that the Brotherhood were able to use in the Second Tiberium War. So it is possible for them to also try to build their own shelters, although probably not on the scale of GDI. That's probably not what they'd be able to do. It would be possible for them to try and subvert or attack GDI structures and try to take them over. Certainly not every GDI bunker would be built to the same level of security as the others. There is another splinter group, however, and they go looking for Cain, right? In the aftermath of Cain's disappearance, these followers are essentially obsessed with trying to find Cain and have him deliver them from the coming apocalypse, right? One of the things that I think has always been interesting about the Brotherhood is they don't necessarily tell people what the plan is. Cain is promising them an ascension, he's promising them a utopia, but to the average person in the Brotherhood, they might see the coming Tiberium winter as the end of the world, right? And they might not understand what the issue is. Now, it might be easy for them to blame GDI. Oh, GDI attacked us before we could launch the missile, and it didn't have its intended effect because they destroyed it, or something like that, right? That's very definitely the line that they would use to try to pacify any Brotherhood dissenters. But be that as it may, they still have to deal with a crisis. So Nod and GDI forces are completely trying to deal with this issue, while many of the most common people who might be sort of in the middle of these forces, they're basically left behind. So time will pass, several decades at least, and we enter into a period which I call the Tiberium Wasteland. Only despite GDI's best efforts, and I do believe that they would make an effort to help people even in the yellow zones. Maybe not the best effort in the world, but definitely they do something. GDI can only save a fraction of their population, and they could put these people into underground shelters. Millions of people are left behind as the world is gradually overtaken by the Tiberium ash cloud. Years later, the GDI survey teams would come out from their bunkers and find that the winter would have abated, but the world would be irrevocably changed by such widespread Tiberium exposure. It wasn't as they expected. Yes, the planet's atmosphere is now not instantly completely lethally toxic, but if you're out there in the exposed air for any amount of time, you will still be getting a latent exposure to Tiberium, which is a lot more deadly than if, say, for example, you were near a Tiberium field, because prior to, of course, all of this stuff, you could still breathe the air, right? You could still breathe the air. Now that's not quite the case. Furthermore, large parts of the landscape were completely transformed by the Tiberium ash into massive, mutated, toxic environments. Something sort of akin to what you might see in Tiberium War 3, basically red zones. Large parts of the world would be converted into red zones. The worst predictions about the change had not come to pass. You could still, in theory, breathe the atmosphere, but long-term exposure would prove fatal. So the planet is alive, but just barely. Lots of our previous civilizations basically were destroyed. Evidence, many human cities would be overtaken by Tiberium. You would find ruined cities, Tiberium infestation all over the place. And the world that the GDI returned to is one that's mostly functionally scoured of life. And it wouldn't be long until, of course, GDI survey teams and recon units would find sightings of black-clad soldiers and strange mechanical constructs. Nod had also survived the Tiberium winter, and unknown to GDI, the next Tiberium war had already begun. Okay, so now I want to talk about the state of play for both the GDI and the Brotherhood in our new Tiberium Wasteland scenario. So let's start with the GDI. So GDI, we've got a directive without nations, as it was. So we know that the GDI were founded, in 1995 by the UN, and they had basically a global mandate as sort of like a peacekeeping force, and they would eventually evolve into like a supranatural nation state. Now we have a new kind of problem, right? We have GDI emerging into a world without any of the nations that had previously once defined them. They are, in a lot of ways, even more of a new type of government, a new type of social order than they were previously. You could have been American in the GDI. You would have identified with their country and maybe, the fact that you're in the GDI. Now you're GDI or you're dead, basically, at least sort of in their context. This military situation is pretty precarious. A large number of economic capacities were saved underground. So GDI did, bring with them the means to build more technology, manufacturing capacity, industrial capacity. They did bring it down, but they have lost a lot of their strength. And they are able to preserve largely intact a lot of the elements of their armies. And as I said, they are now even more united because everybody who survived in the GDI bunker now thinks of themselves as a GDI person, right? I'm no longer an American or like a European or an African or whatever. Now I am GDI or I'm not. And so even though, we've had a lot of difficulty and strife, the GDI structure essentially remains intact. They have lost access to the orbital defense matrix. So previously, the GDI forces had supreme control over space and near-Earth orbit, and they had access to things like ion cannons and so on and so forth, which would be used to a lot of destruction on Nod during the First and Second Tiberium Wars. Because of the Tiberium winter and the long time of maintenance and without any upkeep, the orbital disarray, the orbital network has fallen into disarray, and many of the satellites were either lost or rendered inoperable. For GDI in this new world order, their new objective really is to plan and explore. Right? They need to find the means to basically save the planet if possible. And they need to do that by trying to determine what the resources are, what information is, where is Nod, what can we do, so on and so forth. So to this end, the GDI engineers have proposed the development of a specialized vehicle that can meet all of their strategic and military, and in some cases even economic needs. And it's called the Mark I Hazardous Environment and Strategic Operations Carrier, nicknamed the Mammoth Carrier. Right? This is GDI's essentially answer to the problem that they're facing. The surface environment is too dangerous to try and risk and establish population centers, and they won't be able to really build bases, because resources might be far and few between. You need to be able to retain control and access to the GDI bunker network, and they don't have any global infrastructure, which means that it would be much more difficult to do stuff. And so in order to explore and expand themselves into the wasteland, they need to do so by building mobile production military structures, vehicles, essentially. And to that end, the GDI carrier has both production and resource facilities that allow it to produce GDI vehicles and gather resources from the field. So this vehicle allows them to go into the wastelands, they can harvest resources where they need to, and build highly mobile armies to combat any threats that they might have to face. Carriers can always return back to bunkers for resupplies for things that they can't produce on their own, but the carrier is meant to be a self-sufficient battle group that can move across the wasteland. Carriers themselves are extremely powerful as well. They can mount all manner of weaponry. No Mammoth carrier will be exactly alike. This is not an easy thing for the GDI to produce. Each thing will have a different mission objective, a different type of carrier loadout, maybe potentially. But the idea is that you build and carry a battle force with you. That is these essential fleets, that you can send out and they can counter and deal with Nod as you see fit. Okay, so for the Nod situation, they're in a more precarious issue because they didn't have, they didn't necessarily have everything put together, but the Brotherhood had potentially had plans to build, sort of underground. They had created their, vast secret global tunnel network, right? And this tunnel network was basically the sort of way that Nod was able to survive. Instead of, of course, some Nod forces might have been able to capture or use a GDI bunker or something like that, but the majority of the people of the Brotherhood had to rely on the global tunnel network for their own survival, right? They would have to go into the tunnels and live there. And of course, the global tunnel network was not built for this kind of purpose, but they ended up saving a much larger percentage of the population. And, many people who felt abandoned by GDI would definitely go into this situation to seek their own help. The thing about this, though, is that the policy had come at a cost. The tunnel system, although it became kind of like an underground city, was never designed to house the populations that it did, and scarcity and resource sort of conflict eventually would drive people back onto the surface during the Tiberium winter. So a large percentage of the Nod population, quote unquote, also emerges with Tiberium poisoning and mutation and all sorts of issues, right? So they're even more divergent than baseline humanity, prior to this. Nod is, of course, kind of split on this situation. Some people do think that the world has been transformed into a new Eden. Some people don't, because the Brotherhood of Nod is factitious and decentralized in some respect. Different populations across the globe could grow into different ideologies. Some might have avoided toxic exposure. Some might have embraced it. And this, would cause a bunch of stuff. The most significant, of course, is Cain. Without Cain to hold everything together, Nod kind of fell apart as a central faction, right? And, even though there was a need for some unity to survive this coming apocalypse, total unity was never achieved. And the question is, what happened to Cain? Where did he go? This is a question that hangs over all of Nod. And of course it hangs over the game. Where is Cain? Where has he gone? And in particular, right, one branch that becomes very true, or rather mainline in the context of this story, is that people start to think of Cain as the literal Messiah, right? They start to develop a even more strict, more serious, more severe religion. And because Cain is no longer there, no one is counterbalancing this stuff, right? Nobody is counterbalancing any of the mythology, any of the legend. Cain becomes a literal, true Messiah in like every broad sense, right? Obviously, there were religious undertones to everything, right? There were religious undertones previously, but primarily we have Cain, who is a character who's living, who's existing, who's doing stuff, right? And it's clear that he doesn't necessarily think of that religiosity as anything more than a tool to control people. Here, absent Cain's involvement, people genuinely develop a religious sentiment for him. We have a situation where the majority of the Brotherhood have to leave their tunnels just because they cannot sustain more of their population, and they have to go out into the wasteland to try and survive. And the Brotherhood answer to this problem is very similar to the GDI answer to this problem. They built these... basically expanding on the Montauk vehicle, which was used by Nod General Anton Slavik, they build these massive sort of land vehicles in a similar vein to the Brotherhood Mammoth Carrier. You've got production facilities, Tiberium processing, technologies that you can make use of to survive in the Tiberium wasteland, war factories, and sort of survival colonies, right? And now the Brotherhood are poised to go out into the wasteland and also contest with GDI for control of the Earth. Okay, so you have here a game which is very inspired by Homeworld Deserts of Karak, right? The central mechanism of the world is that you've got these large carriers that can operate and use resource facilities and production facilities to lead basically armored columns to fight each other in the desert. And I think that's a great idea personally. I know that the original Homeworld Deserts of Karak was meant to be more of an emphasis on sort of the idea at least was more of an emphasis on a post-apocalyptic survival game to some extent, and elements of that still make it into the game, but I feel like by combining it with this Tiberium environment, you've got the basis for a game that I think is both mechanically and thematically interesting, right? Narratively interesting. You have a world that does not have Cain in it, but people worship him as if he was there. You have both two factions trying to grapple with this new Tiberium reality, this new uncertainty, and you have lots of questions about what that could mean for both factions going forward, right? Like, where do you want each faction to go? How do you want each faction to respond to the crisis that they've been forced to deal with? I think that's a very interesting question. I think that, when it comes to it, we have to really think about how that will affect, everybody moving forward. The most important unit in your army will be the carrier unit. If you lose that, basically you've lost the game. But the carriers will be quite strong. As of now, present in the game, you can't really do any base building, in the sense that you can't really expand your army. But I do have plans for adding in future the ability for like the carriers to actually produce units. So that is something that can definitely happen in the future. I definitely wanted to add that, and I think this sort of carrier-based approach gives us a sort of a middle ground between having no base building and having some base building, where you can harvest resources using the carriers and then use those resources to expand your own army, but you don't have to worry about building a base. You don't have to worry about having that to put down and all of that stuff. In terms of, I don't want to go into a full breakdown of the rules. You're welcome to read them if you like. In terms of the the important parts, basically you've got a couple of stats that define each unit: their HP, their armor, sensors, their nerve, weapon, and so on and so forth. If your HP goes to 0, boom, you're dead. Your armor value is your armor save. The best value is 1, the worst is 6, so you just roll a d6, and if it's greater than or equal to the value, the attack is nullified. The things, unlike conventional Command & Conquer, units can have a morale, which is indicated by their nerve. So in normal Command & Conquer, no matter what happens, your units will never run away on you. This, I think, is necessary for the type of gameplay that you've got, but it's also not necessarily realistic. I feel like if you're going to have a tabletop game, you kind of need some kind of morale mechanic. So that is implemented here with nerve. Sensors are also different because the sort of operative thing about this is that you don't have the ability to have a complete view of the world. The sensors of your units tell you what kind of information that you get, and there's a phase in the game where everything can, where your sensor units, or rather the sensor values of your units, can tell you what you can do. Okay, so a basic turn consists of a number of phases, specifically 2 phases, the sensor phase and the action phase. The former happens at the start of the turn, and it's basically simultaneous, and the latter is where the majority of the play happens, and it's an alternating activation system. Each game will consist of a number of turns, and at the end of that, usually the game will end and you'll have a number of victory conditions, but that can obviously change, right? So in the sensor phase, both players try to determine the number of what we call SPs, or sensor points, and each unit that has a sensor value greater than 0 generates a number of sensor points. Some units provide a lot more sensor points than others, so the idea is that a unit that has more sensors and gives you more SPs will be weaker in combat versus something. So like a powerful battle tank might not have as many sensor points as a recon vehicle, right? So you've got to make a trade-off between that. After everyone has determined the amount of sensor points you've got, you can throw away any sensor points that you want, you can discard them, and the player who has the lowest number of SPs gets to activate in the action phase first. So again, right, what this represents is you can preserve your sensor points for your own activations, but the enemy will go before you, or you can try and take the initiative by throwing away your sensor points. What that might represent is sort of like counter-intel operations, or electronic warfare or something against the enemy to try and disrupt them. You've got to spend your, you're not as focused on gathering data on the enemy. You're just, sort of trying to hammer them home or counter their operations. The action phase is basically where both players will alternate activating a unit at a time. You can activate one unit and you can take a number of actions with it. You can choose to skip activating a unit. Remember, of course, that you can activate as all of your units. If you finish activating before your opponent, then obviously the action phase just consists of you activating all of your units. You can delay activating, and you can do that, but the cost is 3 SPs. Again, it's more of a counter-electronic warfare thing. You spend your 3 SPs to not activate a unit. You can only activate each unit once. So, you could, in theory, try to save a unit for later and wait to see, what the enemy does by spending some of your SPs. But once everyone has done all of their activations, the turn ends. When a unit is activated, it can do a couple of things. It can remain in play. It can hold, basically move, do an advance, and each of the different units is put into a different class, and each class of units can move a different value, a number of inches, basically. Then, you can obviously do shooting attacks. One of the main reasons why you want SPs is for shooting attacks, because basically what you're doing here is that units are using essentially intel to better triangulate their firing solutions. Once you're trying to hit a target, you by default will hit that target on a 6. But for every SP that you spend, you can reduce that value to a minimum of 2. So, in theory, if you want to really save up your SPs, you can coordinate a very powerful attack that will probably land, as opposed to just distributing your SPs out, sort of like firing a lot more ad hoc. So it really depends how you manage your SPs. That's a good aspect of your your play skill, right? Finally, units can panic, and when they do panic, they will have certain penalties imposed upon them. Panic is important because SP activations and stuff like that that all goes up by that increases in cost, and if a unit fails, if a unit is panicked and it fails its nerf check again, then it's removed as a casualty. So that can be significantly important if you really want to make sure that your units are holding their line. Something else that is also important is air units. Air units are super important and part of the gameplay of Command & Conquer. In this game, we assume that the air units are basically launched from the carriers. So when you are building a force, you can either have sort of strike craft or gunships. Gunships are independent units, so they don't need to be launched from the strike craft. In theory, we might assume that they are hosted within the carrier, but the gunships operate by themselves independently for the majority of combat operations, only returning to the carrier once the battle is over. The strike craft, on the other hand, have to launch from the carrier and have to return back to the carrier. So they're handled by a special rule called a sortie, which costs SPs to launch and to use. And the enemy can also try to intercept your sorties with fighters of their own or anti-air weapons. Each carrier has carrier systems, and these systems can be sensors, armor, engines, weapons, repairs. A lot of this is borrowed very heavily from Homeworld, Deserts of Karak. I really did like the carrier system, trying to balance stuff in real time. So I wanted to implement that here, where you can do stuff like, your carriers can launch sorties, they can try to repair some of your units, you can try and resupply units that have been, killed. There are upgrades and so on and so forth, and then you get into the various types of factions. Every faction has its own dedicated units of various different kinds, from light vehicles all the way to very heavy vehicles. The GDI Mammoth Carrier is a model that I'm particularly proud of, because the Mammoth Carrier, it's this gigantic tracked vehicle. It looks very similar to the Capisi from Homeworld, but you can upgrade it with additional stuff. You can add like a levitation system, a massive railgun, all types of things that you can really upgrade that carrier and turn it into a fearsome weapon. I'm really happy with actually how the looks of these things turned out. Also, the nod sort of carrier is also a very threatening thing. I think in a lot of ways it symbolizes the divergent design philosophies between Nod and GDI, where the Mammoth Carrier is like an industrial-looking, very militarized thing, whereas the Nod Jaguar class carrier is a very different kind of vehicle, right? It's a wheeled vehicle, not a tracked one. It's much more sleek. It's much more angular. It relies more on laser weapons and other kinds of systems, and even holy icons, right? You can spec this thing to include statues of Cain if you really wanted to. And I feel like that just suits the world that I've created a little bit more. Like I said, if you wanted to check this out, please feel free to do so. I am always happy to hear feedback and comments and things like that. Remember to like, share, comment on the video, etc., etc. I hope you have a good day, and welcome back, Commander.